Hey everyone, tonight let's do what we usually do here. Lower the lights, put the phone face down, loosen your shoulders, and let your thoughts drift gently backward in time. Tonight we're talking about cleanliness, or more accurately, the long, confusing, and often very smelly history of trying to be clean before anyone invented deodorant, toothpaste that worked, or the radical concept of washing your hands because germs exist. Because for most of human history, people absolutely did clean themselves. They just did it badly, and with great confidence. So let's drift back slowly, and see how people washed, scrubbed, scented, and occasionally made things much worse. To start, we should clear up a comforting modern myth. The idea that people in the past simply didn't care about hygiene, that everyone wandered around happily coated in filth, completely unaware of their own aroma. This is not quite true. They cared, they worried, they complained, they wrote entire books about cleanliness. They just had the wrong ideas about how to achieve it. In many ancient cultures, cleanliness was not about killing bacteria, because of course, they had no idea bacteria existed. Cleanliness was about balance, about smells, about humors, about appearing orderly enough that the universe wouldn't punish you. Let's drift first into the ancient world. In ancient Egypt, personal hygiene was taken very seriously. Not for health reasons exactly, but for religious and social ones. Egyptians believed cleanliness brought them closer to the gods, which makes sense because gods, naturally, do not enjoy bad smells. Most Egyptians bathed regularly in the Nile, or poured water over themselves at home. Soap as we know it didn't exist yet. Instead, they used a mixture of animal fats and alkaline salts. This technically worked, in the same way sandpaper technically works as skincare. They shaved constantly. Heads, faces, bodies, eyebrows. Hair was seen as unclean, also inconvenient in the desert. So many Egyptians wore wigs instead. Elaborate wigs, heavy wigs, wigs that required their own maintenance routines. Naturally, lice were still a problem, so parents carefully inspected children's scalps. And if lice appeared, the solution was simple. Remove all the hair. Again, perfume was everywhere. Not subtle perfume, strong resin-based oils that melted slowly in the heat and ran down the skin. You didn't smell fresh, you smelled powerful. And if you were wealthy, you smelled like imported incense and crushed flowers. If you were poor, you smelled like optimism. Now let's drift over to ancient Greece. The Greeks loved the idea of cleanliness, but distrusted excess bathing. Too much water was seen as weakening, soft, suspiciously luxurious. They bathed, yes, but not obsessively. Instead, they scraped. Literally. After exercise, Greeks used a curved metal tool called a strigil to scrape sweat, dirt, and oil off their skin. The resulting mixture, called gloios, was a paste. A paste of sweat, oil, dust, and skin cells. This paste was sometimes collected, and sometimes sold. Because of course it was. The Greeks believed this scraping purified the body. And if your body felt raw afterward, that simply meant it was working. Soap was rare. Water was used sparingly. Perfume made a comeback, but again very strong. Greek cleanliness was less about freshness and more about appearing disciplined. Smelling bad was forgivable. Looking indulgent was not. Now we drift gently into Rome. Ah yes, the Romans. If there was one thing Romans loved almost as much as conquest, it was public bathing. Roman bathhouses were enormous. Busy, steamy, loud. Everyone went. Men, women, children, politicians, soldiers. Bathing was social, political, occasionally romantic, frequently unhygienic in ways that would alarm us today. Roman baths did not involve soap. Instead, bathers coated themselves in oil, then scraped it off with a strigil, just like the Greeks. The water was not changed frequently. By the end of the day, the baths were cloudy, with a personality, and yet Romans felt clean, because they were doing something impressive, something communal. Public latrines existed, and here we encounter the infamous Roman sponge on a stick, used instead of toilet paper, shared, rinsed between uses. No one knew. No one questioned it. Everyone carried on. To Romans, cleanliness meant routine, not sterility. And routine they had in abundance. Now let's let the empire gently crumble and drift into medieval Europe. This is where things get misunderstood. Medieval people did bathe. Contrary to popular belief, they did not universally avoid water like it was cursed. Early medieval Europeans bathed more than we often imagine. Public bathhouses existed in many cities, especially before the Black Death. But attitudes slowly changed. Medical theory suggested that hot water opened the pores. Open pores let in disease. Disease was bad. Therefore, bathing was suspicious. Naturally. So bathing became something to do carefully. Occasionally. Preferably under supervision. Instead of bathing often, people focused on linen. Clean linen was the real sign of hygiene. Undergarments were changed frequently. The linen absorbed sweat and oils. The body itself was tolerated. If you wore fresh linen, you were considered clean, even if you hadn't touched water in days. Perfume and herbs became essential. People carried sachets of lavender, rosemary, or cloves. Not just for scent, but to ward off illness. Bad smells were thought to cause disease. This was the miasma theory. If it smelled foul, it was foul. So streets stank. Waste piled up. Animals wandered freely. The solution? Smell something stronger. Now let's talk about teeth. Because dental hygiene is where the past truly humbles us. Toothbrushes did not exist in Europe until very late. Instead, people used cloths, fingers, or chew sticks. Teeth were cleaned with abrasive powders. Crushed bones, charcoal, salt, sometimes ground oyster shells. These powders removed plaque. They also removed enamel. But again, no one knew. Bad breath was blamed on stomach problems, or moral failings, or demons. Naturally, now we drift gently into the lives of the elites. Because royal hygiene was a performance. Kings and queens did bathe. Occasionally. Ceremonially. A royal bath was an event. Servants prepared the water. Herbs were added. Observers attended. Privacy was flexible. Louis XIV of France famously disliked bathing. He preferred rubbing himself with scented cloths. He bathed a handful of times in his life, and each time was considered noteworthy. His court followed his example. Versailles smelled exactly like what you're imagining. Powdered wigs covered unwashed hair. Heavy perfumes masked everything else. And because everyone smelled the same, no one noticed. Royal clothing was aired, brushed, perfumed. Rarely washed. Washing damaged fabric. And fabric mattered more than skin. Now let's drift briefly to illness. When people fell sick, hygiene rituals intensified. Rooms were fumigated with herbs. Clothes were smoked. Bodies were wiped down with vinegar or wine. Hands were rarely washed, because hands were not considered dangerous. Bloodletting, however, was very popular. Naturally, this weakened patients. Naturally, they did it anyway. Cleanliness was about appearances, about balance, about pleasing invisible forces. And yet people adapted. They learned what worked through habit, not theory. Fresh air mattered. Clean clothes mattered. Isolation sometimes helped. Even without understanding germs, people noticed patterns. They just explained them incorrectly. As we drift toward the early modern period, soap slowly returns. Better soap. Plant-based soaps. Less aggressive. Bathing becomes fashionable again. Then unfashionable. Then fashionable. History, like hygiene, moves in cycles. And through it all, people did the best they could with what they had, which most of the time was oil, linen, perfume, and hope. So as you settle deeper into sleep tonight, take comfort in one thing. No matter how tired you are, no matter how long it's been since you last did laundry, you are doing much better than a medieval king wrapped in perfume, convinced that water itself might kill him. Let's drift onward. We've talked about how people thought they were cleaning themselves. Now let's talk about what all of this actually did to their bodies. Especially the bodies that mattered most to history. The royal ones. The ones preserved in portraits, poetry, and very optimistic descriptions. Because royal bodies were not ordinary bodies. They were symbols. Walking, breathing metaphors for divine favor. And therefore, when those bodies malfunctioned, it caused a great deal of quiet panic. Royal hygiene was never just personal. It was political. A king who smelled too strongly was mocked. A queen who appeared too pale was whispered about. Skin, teeth, hair, posture, everything was watched. But actual medical care lagged far behind the expectations. Let's start with childhood. Royal children were born into linen, incense, and constant supervision. They were cleaned frequently, wiped, rubbed, powdered. Bathing, however, was still approached cautiously. Too much water could weaken the child. Too cold could shock them. Too warm could open pores and invite disease. So instead, children were cleaned in pieces. Hands wiped, faces dabbed, feet rinsed, hair combed obsessively. Combing was serious business. Lice inspections were daily rituals. Royal nurses examined scalps with religious focus. If lice were found, it was considered unfortunate, but not shameful. Everyone had them, even kings. The difference was how discreetly it was handled. Royal children were also heavily perfumed. Powders of iris root, rose, and violet were used to keep them sweet. Sweetness in this context meant not alarming the court. Teeth were a constant problem. Sugar consumption among elites skyrocketed in the late medieval and early modern periods. And dental care did not keep up. Toothaches were common. Extractions were brutal. And rotting teeth were masked with cloves, wine rinses, and breath pastilles. A smiling portrait was a political risk. Now let's drift into adulthood. Royal bathing habits varied wildly. Some monarchs loved water. Others avoided it like an untrustworthy relative. Elizabeth I of England famously bathed about once a month, which for the time was considered quite reasonable, possibly even indulgent. She changed linen frequently, used perfumes, was meticulous about appearances, and yet smallpox scarred her skin, so she wore thick white makeup made with lead. This made her face smooth. It also slowly poisoned her. Clean on the outside, quietly decaying underneath. Which, honestly, is a fairly accurate summary of many royal hygiene practices. Let's talk hair. Hair washing was rare. Instead, hair was brushed. And brushed. And brushed. Brushing redistributed oils. It removed surface dirt. It also spread whatever else was living there. Powders were added. Then more powders. Then wigs. Wigs were a triumph of illusion. They covered hair loss, lice, sores, and the consequences of illness. They also trapped heat and moisture, and occasionally developed ecosystems. Wigs were cleaned, yes. Sometimes baked to kill lice. Sometimes dusted with more powder and optimism. Now the body beneath the clothes. Royal clothing was heavy, layered, constraining. Corsets restricted breathing. Tight collars rubbed skin raw. Shoes were stiff and unforgiving. Sweat accumulated. Skin broke down. Bathing would have helped, but bathing was complicated. A full bath required heating water, moving it, preparing herbs, and clearing schedules. It was expensive, time-consuming, so instead, servants performed daily maintenance. Bodies were wiped down with damp cloths, often soaked in scented water or alcohol. This removed surface grime. It also irritated skin. Small rashes were common. So were infections. But these were not discussed openly. A monarch did not itch. A monarch did not ooze. A monarch merely appeared contemplative. Now let's drift gently into the bedroom. Royal sleeping arrangements were not private. Beds were shared, not always romantically. Servants slept nearby. Courtiers lingered. Medical attendants hovered. Nighttime hygiene was minimal. Hands might be wiped. Faces dabbed. Teeth ignored until morning, or until pain demanded attention. And when pain came, it was handled decisively. Teeth were pulled, often without anesthesia, often too late. Abscesses spread. Infections traveled. Deaths from dental infections were not rare. They were simply underreported. Let's drift now to the idea of smell. Smell was everything. A pleasant scent signaled health, morality, and divine favor. A bad smell suggested corruption, inside and out. This is why perfumes were so important. Not delicate modern perfumes. Heavy, resinous, lingering scents. Musk, ambergris, civet. These scents did not fade quickly. They clung. A well-perfumed royal could mask weeks of limited washing. And since everyone else was doing the same, the illusion held. Until illness arrived. Disease disrupted everything. When plague or fever struck, hygiene rituals intensified. Rooms were sealed. Fires burned constantly. Bodies were rubbed with vinegar. Clothes were smoked. Hands were still not washed between patients, because that idea had not occurred to anyone yet. Doctors wore elaborate outfits, masks filled with herbs, gloves that were reused. They smelled protected, which felt like protection. Royal sick rooms became theaters of scent. Incense burned day and night. The air grew thick. The patient grew weaker. Now let's pause for a moment, because it's easy to laugh at all this. And yes, some of it is absurd. But remember, they were not ignorant. They were working with the best knowledge available. They observed patterns. They tried to control risk. They just misunderstood the cause. And sometimes, they accidentally did things that helped. Frequent linen changes reduced parasites. Fresh air reduced transmission. Isolation slowed outbreaks. They didn't know why it worked, but they noticed that it worked. Now let's drift toward the end of life. Royal corpses were cleaned meticulously, because death did not end appearances. Bodies were washed, sometimes thoroughly, sometimes symbolically. Organs were removed, preserved separately. Hearts traveled to different burial sites. The body was perfumed heavily, not to honor the dead, but to protect the living. Embalming was inconsistent, sometimes careful, sometimes disastrous. Royal funerals smelled complicated, and yet these rituals reinforced the idea that cleanliness mattered, even in death. So what do we take from all this? People in the past were not filthy by choice. They were methodical. They were consistent. They just lacked the final piece of the puzzle. Germs, invisible, indifferent, unimpressed by perfume. And it would take centuries before someone suggested the unglamorous solution. Soap, water, and washing your hands. But that realization belongs to another drifting hour. For now, rest with the knowledge that history's most powerful people were constantly managing bodies that betrayed them. Scratching, aching, smelling faintly of rose and decay. And somehow they ruled empires anyway. Let's drift onward. Settle a little deeper. Slow your breathing. Let the background noise soften. Because now we arrive at one of history's most dependable mistakes. Royal marriage. Not the romantic kind. Not the kind involving affection, compatibility, or basic genetic common sense. The kind involving cousins, and uncles, and occasionally nieces. Because, of course, for most of history, royal marriages were not about love. They were about land, borders, treaties, and the deep, unshakable fear of losing power to someone not related to you, which led to a very specific problem. The royal family tree began to fold in on itself. Gently at first, then enthusiastically. Let's ease into this slowly. In medieval and early modern Europe, marriage between close relatives was officially discouraged by the church. Very discouraged. On paper, in practice, dispensations were handed out generously, especially if the families involved were rich, powerful, and persuasive, which they always were. First cousins became standard. Second cousins barely raised an eyebrow. Uncle-niece marriages happened more often than anyone likes to admit. The justification was always the same: keeping bloodlines pure, which sounds impressive until you realize what purity actually meant. It meant limited options, repeated genes, and a growing collection of inherited problems quietly moving through generations. But let's not rush. At first, the effects were subtle. Children were small, sickly, delicate. Royal portraits compensated generously. Painters were instructed to smooth skin, brighten eyes, and gently ignore deformities. Reality was adjusted. Nowhere is this more famously visible than in the Habsburg family. Ah yes, the Habsburgs. If royal inbreeding were an Olympic sport, they would have medaled consistently. The Habsburgs married into themselves for centuries. Spanish branch, Austrian branch, then back again. By the time we reached the 17th century, the genetic consequences were no longer subtle. They were visible, prominent, jutting forward. The Habsburg jaw, a large protruding lower jaw. Difficulty chewing, speech impediments, not fatal on its own, just deeply inconvenient, and deeply inherited. Each generation reinforced it, passed it along proudly, as if it were a family heirloom. Now let's drift to Charles II of Spain. Charles was born in 1661. He was the product of generations of close relative marriages. His family tree did not branch. It looped. Charles was frail from infancy. He struggled to speak, to walk, to eat. He suffered from frequent illnesses, developmental delays, and chronic weakness. Contemporaries described him as always on the brink of death, which, to be fair, he often was. He did marry twice. Neither marriage produced children, which shocked no one who had met him. Doctors were baffled. Priests prayed. Court officials whispered. Charles ruled Spain in name, but real power drifted elsewhere. When he died at 38, Europe collectively held its breath, because the Spanish throne had no clear heir. This triggered a massive war. Naturally, one fragile body, years of genetic denial, and suddenly an entire continent was fighting. But Charles was not unique. Royal Europe was filled with marriages that quietly failed to produce healthy heirs. Let's drift to France. The French royal family was slightly more cautious, but still enthusiastic about strategic cousin marriages. Louis XIII and Anne of Austria were first cousins. Their marriage took 23 years to produce a surviving child. 23 years. The pressure was relentless, the gossip endless. When Louis XIV was finally born, he was treated less like a baby and more like a miracle that required constant surveillance. He survived, barely, and he grew up deeply aware of how fragile royal succession could be, which may explain why he had so many children, legitimate and otherwise, quantity as insurance. Now let's drift east. The Russian royal family, the Romanovs, entered the inbreeding game later. But once they did, they committed fully. By the 19th century, Romanovs were marrying into other heavily interrelated European royal families. Hemophilia entered the bloodline through Queen Victoria's descendants. A single genetic mutation quietly traveled across courts. Bleeding disorders appeared in royal sons. Small injuries became life-threatening. In Russia, this manifested most tragically in Tsarevich Alexei. Alexei was the only son of Nicholas II, the future of the dynasty. He suffered from hemophilia. Every bruise was dangerous. Every fall terrifying. His parents were desperate. This desperation led them to Rasputin. Because when medicine fails, mysticism becomes very appealing. Alexei's condition destabilized the royal family, which destabilized the empire, which ended badly for everyone involved. Again, one inherited condition. Widening outward. Now let's pause gently, because not all consequences were dramatic. Some were simply sad. Many royal women endured repeated pregnancies that ended in miscarriage or stillbirth, often blamed on moral weakness or divine punishment. In reality, genetic incompatibility played a role. Women were exhausted, physically depleted, emotionally isolated, and yet they were expected to keep trying, because a healthy male heir mattered more than the woman producing him. Now let's drift to appearance. Royal portraits often hide it, but written records reveal much. Crossed eyes, weak limbs, epilepsy, speech difficulties. These were noted politely, in footnotes, in letters marked confidential. Doctors attempted treatments, bloodletting, herbal tonics, strange diets. None of these addressed the cause, because no one wanted to admit the truth. The problem was not fate, not God, not humors. It was family strategy. But abandoning that strategy felt impossible. Royal families believed marrying outsiders was dangerous. Foreign blood meant foreign influence. Better to marry a cousin you trusted than a stranger you didn't. And so the cycle continued. Each generation hoped to be the lucky one, the one where it worked out. Sometimes it did. Often it didn't. And when it didn't, the consequences were absorbed quietly. A child who didn't survive. A ruler who couldn't rule. A line that ended. History smoothed it over. But the bodies remembered. So as you drift towards sleep, consider this gentle irony. The most powerful families in history were undone not by enemies, but by their own dining tables, their own weddings, their own refusal to look outward. They built empires, they conquered lands, and then they married their cousins until the empire collapsed under the weight of fragile heirs.